My name's Robin Friend, I'm a photographer and I make work about the British landscape. So I first got serious about photography during my college years. I started by doing a course in Brighton and then I went on to do a BA in Exeter, which was Plymouth Uni, but it was Exeter at the time. Then I did a master's at the Royal College of Art. I guess at the start I was just experimenting and doing a bit of everything. And then when I started my BA, Jem Southern was one of the teachers, the tutors there, a great British landscape photographer. I was just watching him in the darkroom print these amazing contact prints with his, he shoots on 10x8. And I just got the bug for the landscape. So I started going to Dartmoor, which was the national park nearby. And I would just drive and walk and see what I found with my large format 5x4 camera. So over the course of 14, 15 years, I've been working on this project, which is called Pasture Countryside, which started off as sort of 4 or 5 different series, small series, and then I realised a few years ago that actually this was, it was one body of work. And so I first started Pasture Countryside, if I think about it, when I was doing my BA. I was taking pictures of dilapidated greenhouses, which I thought were really interesting. These structures that were designed to control and manipulate nature, if you like. I was interested in when those structures were starting to sort of break down and sort of, well, fall back into the landscape, if you like, and then you had sort of the foliage and the plants, nature growing back, so it was sort of turned on its head. So that was a small series I did. I also did a series about scarecrows. I found them to be really interesting, sort of effigies in the landscape. For me at first it was about the psychology of the farmer, or the person that had made them. I found that really interesting because they're obviously made to look, they're tailored in a certain way. And then there was a sort of small series about the West Country, because that's where I was studying at the time. All these little series then started to sort of relate to each other in different ways, and that's when I started looking into the idea of the Pasture Countryside, which is a quote by Victor Hugo. Well, when he coined the phrase, it was about Paris. He saw Paris as this sort of big beast that was sort of moving out into the countryside and sort of devouring everything in its path. And I really liked that sort of metaphor and started thinking about my own ideas about our relationship with the natural world and how that was distorted and confused and breaking down. I was born in London, but by the age of 1.5, my family had decided to move to Australia. So I spent most of my childhood growing up in Australia. We came back and forwards a little bit, but spent the majority of my time there. When I first started making pictures in England, I feel like I was always looking for the Australian landscape in a way, what I remembered. So if you look at the pictures in the book, there's a lot of rusty oranges and sort of autumnal colours. I mean, I love rust. There's a lot of rust in the book. And I think that's because of the Australian landscape and how it affected me when I was growing up. It was a way to get to know the country that I live in, I think a lot of young people want to travel, which I did as well, but they want to travel immediately and I've been to lots of countries around the world, but actually when you come back and you're like, shit man, I haven't been to Manchester or Liverpool, that's kind of crazy for me. So it was about getting to know the country that I live in. I didn't feel a connection to one particular place. I felt like it was more interesting to get a democratic sort of overview of the country as a whole. I guess I was looking at it as a sort of adventure, go out and just don't know where you're heading. That for me was exciting. There's a big history of landscape painting, for example. And I guess I'm turning that on its head, the sort of the pastoral nature of Turner and, well, more so Constable and Gainsborough. For me, they were documenting their England, their UK, and I'm doing the same, just with a camera, I mean, a lot of people do say, why did it take so long? That's 14, 15 years is a long time to make a book, a body of work. But for me, it felt natural working with large format. I mean, it's just naturally a slow way of working anyway. I remember when Jem said once that if he got sort of 9 or 10 pictures in a year, that was a successful year, And I heard that when I was 20, 21 or something, and maybe that was not the right thing to hear at the time, but it obviously, it obviously affected me. Because every year, when I got 3 or 4 pictures that were successful, I thought, well, that's not too bad if Jem's getting 9 or 10, I mean, it just took its course. Life gets in the way. I've had some kids and working on other projects. So it wasn't just about landscape, got to pay the bills, you know. So I do commissions, do portraits, I do editorial, but I always found myself coming back to this kind of work. There were different ways of making the pictures. Sometimes I would have a destination in mind where I wanted to go to, where I'd seen something and I thought there might be a picture there. On other occasions, it would be more about the trip from A to B, so it'd be what you found on the journey going to that place. So I think only a couple of the pictures that I set out to go and make made it into the book. It was more about chance, it was more about what you came across. For me, that was the more interesting side of things. So when I was doing my masters, I started to become frustrated with photography and how easy it was becoming. So that's when I started going down these old mines in North Wales. I really wanted to try and make it difficult to make a picture. So obviously going down a mine, you have to use ropes, lights, can't see where you're going. Photography relies on light. So I really wanted to sort of take out the ingredients that were easy for photography to happen and make it difficult. So one of the final pictures in the bastard countryside is from one of these trips. And it's basically this mine, or this quarry that's got tons of like old cars and washing machines, various bits of trash thrown into this mine. And it's sort of piled up like a rusty waterfall. When we came across that, it was just insane. So we basically had to, I'd heard about it, but I hadn't seen a proper picture of it. So we had to go and see it. And so we abseiled down this sort of cliff face and then sort of shimmied along this cavern, and eventually it opens up to this, you know, this rusty waterfall. And in the foreground, there's this massive sort of, lake, pond. And it had all this floating like washing machines and microwaves and various different structures. So we had to get an inflatable boat and pump it up and traipse out into the water and move away all the different bits and bobs. Because it was a really long exposure, so it would have ruined that sort of Rorschach effect that's in the picture. And then it was a case of using a bit of fill-in handheld torch. There was a sort of crack in the ceiling, so that was letting natural light come down. On the first time I came back to London, developed it, and it hadn't worked as well as I thought it would. So we had to go back again, get in the boat, traipse out, like toxic water all over your hands. That's why I've only got, you know. But yeah, for me that was important, that challenge at the time, what I was going through, I had to earn the picture. So the photography I do is a combination. It's the book side of things, with the bastard countryside, but it's also commercial and, more so editorial, I'd say. I've done various book commissions in the past. I've done a book called Sanctuary, which was about artists and their studios, and we did another book in America in a similar way. And so through that I met some of my heroes like Hiroshi Sugimoto, I met Gregory Crutzen, I met Lorna Simpson, and we photographed them, and it was this big book which had an interview with each artist. But on the other flip side, I also do print sales of my own, you know, my personal work. But it is a juggling act, you know, naturally. You've got to sort of find your own way to navigate the waters. I wrote and directed this programme for the BBC, which was about the National Gallery during the Second World War, when they hid all their paintings in a mine in North Wales. It started out as a photography project. I was getting into this mine, which is still a working slate mine, but there's part of it that's off limits, and this is where they hid all the National Gallery paintings during the Second World War. So I was making the pictures of this mine and the infrastructure that was in it, the old galleries and the places that the paintings were once kept, but they weren't telling the story well enough. So that's when I started thinking about moving image and how we could tell the story through that, and that's when I started thinking about we could tell the story through dance, and that's when I approached the amazing Wayne McGregor. I approached him, and then we pitched it to the BBC and we made this programme. And so the moral of the story essentially is, if you don't ask, you don't get. I mean, I wish I'd known that when I was younger. Don't be afraid to approach someone in that institution or that gallery, you know, or in that job. What's the worst that can happen? They can only say no. You know, I think people overthink these things.